The Doctor Who franchise was starting to find its groove by the end of 1992. Under the stewardship of producer Ian Fraser, script editor Ben Aronovich, and with Richard Griffiths leading the show had started to dig itself out of the grave it had slowly been sinking into since 1985. But as 1993 rolled around, the pressure was on for the Doctor Who production team. With the show's 30th anniversary around the corner, all eyes would be on them. This was the show's big break to once and for all prove its worth in the current TV landscape. Would it? Season 30 of Doctor Who would have starred Richard Griffiths as the 8th Doctor, along with Julia Ormond as Rain Cunningham, Mark Greenstreet as Higgs, and Lisa Bauman as new companion Bernice Summerfield. It would also see Ian Fraser acting as producer with Ben Aronovich as script editor. Season 30 was to be a big year for Doctor Who, marking the show's 30th anniversary, as well as some notable changes to the show. With Doctor Who having gained back some of its popularity over the past 2 years, a new BBC One controller, Alan Yentob, having more positive feelings towards the show than its predecessors, the show was given an additional 6 episodes, meaning that Season 30 would now consist of 20 episodes across 6 stories, with 4 3-parters and 2 4-parters. With this episode increase, there was also a slight increase to the budget to compensate. Furthermore, it was announced that a 90-minute 30th anniversary special had been greenlit, which was set to air as close to the show's anniversary as possible. This season would see the departure of both Julia Ormond and Mark Greenstreet. Seeing the potential of a mid-season's ratings boost, Fraser and Aronovich devised a plan to introduce a new companion midway through the season, with Rain leaving in the following story and Higgs departing in the season finale. Rather than create a new character themselves, they instead asked the writers of Season 30 to include a character in their stories which could potentially go on to become the next companion. The potential characters were a descendant of the Brigadier in Episode 1, a new Time Lady in Episode 2, an archaeologist from the future in Episode 3, and a nurse character in Episode 6. Ultimately, the character that was chosen was the archaeologist, Bernice Summerfield, with actress Lisa Bauman, who'd previously played a cheetah person in Season 26's Survival, cast in the role. Lastly, a new TARDIS exterior would debut this season. This new exterior, designed by Mike Tucker, would harken back more to the shape of the original Peter Prohaski prop, whilst retaining design choices from the Tommy Audley Jones exterior. Season 30 would air between the 3rd of July 1993 and the 13th of November 1993, with the 30th anniversary special airing on the 27th of November 1993. It would consist of 20 episodes across 6 stories, with 4 3-parters and 2 4-parters, plus 1 90-minute episode, and would go out weekly on Saturday night. This story would have been set in London in the year 2109. We begin with the TARDIS landing on a stellar tunnel, an interstitial connection which could be used for interplanetary or interstellar transport. The Doctor and Higgs step outside, where they're instantly thrown into danger, as the TARDIS, with Rain still inside, is hailed to the end of the line, somewhere in another station. The Doctor and Higgs, meanwhile, find themselves working with a woman named Kadiatu, a descendant of the Brigadier. They work with her to find out what is threatening the Sol Transit System, a big interstellar transport system that's linked to multiple worlds. The Doctor soon realises that the system hasn't been invaded by an outside intelligence because it's structured in the form of a complex neural network and has evolved its own intelligence. However, the system was breached by a competing intelligence from another dimension, which the Doctor nicknames Fred, which has breached the system where reality was thin along the tunnel's path. We learn that Fred is the ruler of a standalone dimension, which is separate from our own universe and complete with its own laws of physics. The story then sees the Doctor and Higgs working with Kadiatu to get Rain back, with her becoming possessed by Fred, and stop Fred from entering their universe and destroying the system. Soon, the group make their way to Fred's own dimension, where Fred attempts to assimilate the Doctor's form. However, Fred is defeated when Kadiatu takes the form of a fierce black leopard, which gives the Doctor the chance to remove Fred from Rain's mind, resulting in Fred being devoured by the leopard. The story then ends with the group returning to their universe, with the gateway to Fred's universe closing off. The Doctor then clears up any remaining loose ends before he, Rain and Higgs return to the TARDIS. This story sees the TARDIS yet again being summoned back to Gallifrey. The Doctor is put on trial by the new president of Gallifrey, Colleen, played by Jane Asher, who states that the Matrix predicts that the Doctor will be responsible for the destruction of the Time Lords. The Doctor finds himself without a representative, however, one Time Lord gladly offers to help the Doctor, Romana. The pair plead innocent and say that the Doctor is incapable of such crimes. However, Colleen states that the Doctor is a known criminal and has proven himself countless times of such dangerous powers, which results in the Doctor being found guilty and sentenced to death in 2 days. The Doctor is confined to a cell, however, Romana, Rain and Higgs are allowed to remain free. The group agrees that, whilst the Doctor does have a habit of interfering, he would never go as far as destroying Gallifrey. Knowing that they must save the Doctor, and suspicious of Colleen knowing more than she lets on, the trio decide to investigate. It turns out that Colleen faked the evidence of the Doctor's crime, and has been sentencing other Time Lords to death for similar crimes which, upon investigating, none were guilty of. Not only that, but it turns out that Colleen has faked and manipulated her way into power at every possible turn, and should never have become Lady President of Gallifrey in the first place. We discover that Colleen is killing every Time Lord which could oppose her plans, which involves her abolishing the non-interference policy and going to war with the universe. We then see Romana, Rain and Higgs exposing Colleen's plans and getting the Doctor released. The group and a handful of Time Lord guards trap and corner Colleen. However, before she can be arrested, Colleen takes Romana hostage and teleports away to the escape shuttles, where she throws Romana aside and attempts to free Gallifrey. However, Colleen is defeated when the Doctor hacks into the pod's flight controls and reprograms it to return to Gallifrey, where Colleen is then captured by Time Lord security. The story then ends with the Doctor and Rain saying goodbye to Romana, with Romana telling the Doctor that Colleen will be likely found guilty. She then realises that the planet has no president. The Inquisitor then suggests the Doctor could maybe rerun as a candidate, before he quickly suggests Romana as a candidate. Romana says she's never thought about the idea before, but she's willing to give it a go. The Doctor smiles and says, "Well, if I was ever to get involved with the tediousness of Gallifreyan politics, I'd certainly vote for you," before he, Rain and Higgs enter the TARDIS and dematerialise. This story sees the Doctor, Rain and Higgs arriving on Heaven, a planet home to both humans and Draconians in the 26th century, as the Doctor is in search of a manuscript named the Papers of Felsakar. Meanwhile, Rain gets acquainted with a group of travellers, including Jan, who Rain begins to fall for, Rosia, who's in an open relationship with both Jan and another traveller, Maria, Christopher the priest of the travellers, who has no sex, and a guest of the travellers, archaeologist Benny Summerfield, who is conducting a dig at some ancient ruins left behind by the now extinct Heavenites, the former inhabitants of the planet. Meanwhile, the Doctor and Higgs are unable to find the manuscript. However, the head of the military forces on Heaven tells the Doctor about a mysterious sphere in space, which was spotted briefly before vanishing. The Doctor then meets Bernice, who he helps to open a way to an old Heavenite observatory. Inside, they find a strange telescope and a decaying body of a Heavenite. They also find some ancient writing which, upon deciphered, reveals a plot by a race known as the Hufi to use Heaven to create an army of the dead. Realising the danger that the falling Hufi fibres could cause, the Doctor orders Bernice to quickly unearth the observatory, which could detect otherwise invisible Hufi spears. Then, knowing that Jan, who Rain has totally fallen in love with, has been infected by a Hufi fibre, the Doctor manipulates him into putting Rain to sleep with a drug and taking a shuttle on his own to the Hufi sphere. However, Marie wakes up Rain and they follow Jan and sneak on board. On board the shuttle, Jan asks Rain to marry him if they survive, and Rain says yes. However, when the ship comes under attack, Jan ejects Rain and Marie from the shuttle. Then, making contact with the Doctor from pewter space, a form of virtual reality in heaven, Jan ignites the sphere with his powers, killing 3 of the sphere's 4 Houthi and sacrificing himself. With the day saved, the Doctor returns to Rain and tries to apologise to her. However, Rain is filled with hatred and anger at the Doctor, saying that he was only jealous that Jan would take her away from him and refuses to travel with him anymore. Rain begins to march away from the Doctor. However, filled with guilt and anger at himself, the Doctor grabs Rain by the arm and drags her on board the TARDIS, with Rain kicking and screaming to let her go. Higgs and Bernice see the commotion and dash over to try and stop the Doctor. They follow him into the TARDIS, where the Doctor's released Rain and is stomped over to the console. Rain, with tears flooding from her eyes, tries to run out of the TARDIS, but is blocked by Bernice and Higgs. Rain tries pushing past them, but it's too late. The TARDIS doors have been closed, and the TARDIS itself has dematerialised. A few moments later, Bernice and Higgs are able to calm down Rain and stop her from attacking the Doctor. Then, once Rain is settled, she demands the Doctor to take her home. The Doctor, realising that this is the end of their travels, agrees and sets some controls on the console. However, the episode would end with the TARDIS being pulled off course by an unknown force and is sent crashing through space. This story begins with the TARDIS crash landing on Earth. However, the Doctor, Rain, Higgs and Bernice come to discover that this is Earth from an alternative timeline where the Earth has been conquered by the Silurians. They discover that in this universe, the 3rd Doctor was killed by the Silurian named Morka in the 1970s story, The Silurians, meaning he was never able to create a cure for the Silurian virus, which wiped out most of humanity and allowed the Silurians to reclaim the Earth. The story would see the quartet working with the surviving humans and the Silurians in an attempt to prevent a nuclear war between the 2 races and make peace between them, whilst also working on a way to escape the parallel universe. The story would see the Doctor meet an alternative versions of the Pertwee unit family, such as the Brigadier, who is the leader of the Resistance and a much bitter man, Benton, who is also more bitter and hateful towards the Silurians, and Liz Shaw, who is a widow in this universe. The story also sees the Doctor meeting an older version of Morka, who is responsible for his death in this timeline. We see that he is now mellowed with age and now understands the horrors of his crime that he committed in his youth, as the deaths of both the Doctor and Octel, the former leader of the Silurians, have haunted him ever since. By the end of the story, the Doctor is able to stop a potential nuclear war and help the Silurians and humans make peace. However, the Doctor is hit with a dilemma as he reveals to his companions that this universe is slowly draining the life out of their universe, and so the Doctor has no choice but to destroy the parallel universe to save their own. Whilst Bernice is upset, she accepts the Doctor's arguments that this must be done. Rain and Higgs, however, are ashamed of the Doctor. Rain specifically takes the Doctor's decision badly. She calls him out on his recent behaviour and demands that she goes home now. Heartbroken but understanding, the Doctor sets the controls for Rain's time. Upon landing, the Doctor opens the door and tries to say goodbye to Rain. However, Rain, without even acknowledging him, walks out of the TARDIS and closes the door behind her. In the console room, the Doctor says goodbye to her while watching her from the scanner, before dematerialising the TARDIS. He then turns to Bernice and Higgs and apologises to them. He asks Higgs if he's ready to go home yet, to which he says he doesn't know, but he needs some time alone, before turning away from the conversation and retreating into the TARDIS. He then turns to Bernice and offers to take her back to heaven, but, feeling as though there's nothing left for her there, Bernice says she wouldn't mind travelling with the Doctor for a bit. She believes there is good in him, but he needs someone to travel with him, to remind him of who he is, and to give him a reason to fight the evil in the universe. This story sees the Doctor, Higgs and Bernice travelling to the planet Hoaxim after the TARDIS detects a Mortem flicker, a temporal anomaly which disrupts events and objects from their proper positions in space and time. When the Doctor looks up the planet in the TARDIS's databanks, he finds a reference to Gustav Ernst, an author of the 25th century who vanished after claiming to have found a legendary planet known as Sakrat, whose people apparently reached the pinnacle of technological advancement, the highest science, and then destroyed themselves with it. Whilst on the planet, the Doctor and Bernice are separated from Higgs after an encounter with a troop of Shalonians, war-heavy turtle-like aliens who were transported to the planet by the Flicker. Higgs soon finds himself with a group of young travellers from the 22nd century named Rodomte, Malassi and Sendai, who'd also been transported to the planet, where they eventually discover a ruined city which used to belong to the people of the planet. Meanwhile, the Doctor and Bernice discover a group of humans from the 1990s who have also been drawn to the planet by the Flicker, before he witnesses the arrival of a dangerous criminal named Shadulka, who, alongside a genetically engineered super intellect named the Cell, who after a century of evolving has begun to wish for death, are in search of the highest science, as he believes Hoaxum is Sakrat. Taken hostage, the Doctor is forced to reveal his own knowledge of the science, which leads Shadulka to the Citadel where they rediscover Higgs. However, after managing to enter the building's inner sanctum, the group discovers that the entire planet has been a trap for Shadulka. We learn that over a century ago, he stole the cell from its creators, the owners of Checkley's world, in search for the highest science. However, learning that it would take him several centuries to reach the highest science, he went into suspended animation. During this time, the people of Checkley's world changed Hoaxum, which was very much a dead planet, to resemble Sakrat, and that all of this was a trap set in an attempt to retrieve the cell. However, the slow time chamber they built on the planet had malfunctioned, which created a Fortin flicker, and ironically caused the legend of Sakrat to be spread through the past across the galaxy. The Doctor then gives the cell the death it's long desired. Meanwhile, with his life work revealed as meaningless, Shadulka chooses to commit suicide. The story then ends with the Doctor, Higgs and Bernice managing to escape the city before it explodes and rescuing the remaining humans from being slaughtered by the Shalonians. This story sees the Doctor, Higgs and Bernice arriving on an Earth-like colony world named Firmament. Exiting the TARDIS, they find themselves standing in a wrecked city. The streets are deserted and destroyed, the sounds of occasional gunfire and shouting echoing through the streets, and the little population are seemingly terrified of something. The Doctor tries to talk to one of these people, asking what they're afraid of. They say they live in fear of their masters, the demons from the sky. The Doctor tries to push for a name of these demons, and, to the trio's horror, they recognise the name of said demons: Daleks. Through some investigation, the Doctor discovers how the Daleks came to be on this planet and why everyone lives in the fear of the Daleks. We learn that the planet's population was being controlled by a machine known as the Agris device, which controlled people's thoughts and emotions in an effort to prevent crimes on the planet, which was created using a material from the planet's centre known as Zeronian. The Daleks invaded the planet, toppled its government and took over the Agris device, reprogramming it so that the population feared the Daleks and wouldn't form any resistance against them. The story sees the Doctor, Higgs and Bernice finding a very small resistance, which is led by those who are somehow immune to the Agris device, to try and find out why the Daleks invaded the planet and how to defeat them. One of these members would be a nurse named Patricia Sanders, who, as stated earlier, was a companion that never was. They eventually discover that the Daleks have set up mines across the planet in search for more Zeronium, and they plan to create an even bigger Agris device, which will allow them to easily conquer and destroy every known galaxy. Eventually, the Doctor is able to defeat the Daleks by finding the original Agris device and reprogramming it so that the people of the planet not only fear the Daleks, but hate the Daleks with a burning passion, which causes the planet to resist against the Daleks and eventually destroy their task force. The story then ends with the Daleks defeated and the Doctor wishing the population luck with rebuilding their society. However, before the trio can enter the TARDIS, Higgs announces that he's not coming with him. He explains that, being a former soldier in the Dalek War, he knows how badly the Daleks can affect worlds even after their defeat, and after everything that's happened recently with Rain, he feels as though he needs some time away from the Doctor. Therefore, he's choosing to remain on the planet to help rebuild it. The Doctor says he understands his decision and wishes him luck. Bernice says goodbye to Higgs, with the two sharing a hug, before the Doctor and Bernice return to the TARDIS. This would have been a 90-minute special, separate from season 30, which was set to mark the 30th anniversary of Doctor Who. The story would have been set across multiple places and time zones, and would have starred Doctors 3 to 8 as well as their respective companions. These companions being Liz Shaw, Sarah Jane, Nyssa, Peri and Ace. We begin with the Doctor and Bernice in the TARDIS, where they receive a distress call from the Doctor's first two incarnations. 8 follows the signal, however, he has unknowingly fallen for a trap set by the Master. We see that the Master has trapped the first two incarnations of the Doctor in a temporal pocket as bait for the current Doctor, as when 8 tries to use his TARDIS to free his former selves, the trap is sprung. Suddenly the TARDIS begins to shake and rattle, with 8 trying to stabilise the TARDIS. Then suddenly, in a burst of light, the Doctor vanishes into thin air. We then see flashes of the Doctor's former selves also blinking into thin air, as they're displaced in time. The story would then be split into 6 mini-plots, where we see Doctors 3 to 8 in different points in their timeline. Their TARDISes have somehow been sealed shut and time has gone wrong, as they and their companions have seemingly aged somewhat. They must find out what's caused all this, whilst dealing with whatever their other incarnation was dealing with at the time. The third Doctor would end up in 2003 with Peri Brown, as he must work with Winfred Bambera to stop a Cyberman invasion in Manchester. He's eventually able to do so by tinkering with the Cyber Planner and, as he puts it, reverses the polarity of the neutron flow. The fourth Doctor finds himself stuck in suspended animation within the Master's TARDIS, as he swapped places with the 8th Doctor. He makes telepathic contact with Bernice and helps her land the TARDIS into the Master's secondary control room. 4 explains that if she can find and free him, he might be able to help free his other selves. Whilst exploring the Master's TARDIS, Bernice discovers the companions of the 1st and 2nd Doctor being held in stasis, these being Susan and Victoria. She unfreezes them and the two of them help Bernice through the TARDIS. However, they soon discover that there is an Ogron within the corridors. The group, however, eventually overpower the Ogron and lock it in a room. The 5th Doctor finds himself in the past with Liz Shaw. He must prevent a Sontaran named Jake from causing a nuclear reactor to go into meltdown. We learn that Jake is a disgraced Sontaran, as he chose not to die in glory, and so he plans to end his life by destroying millions as well. 5 and Liz are eventually able to make Jake realise that he doesn't have to believe in the Sontaran cause. However, before the Doctor can stop him, the Brigadier shows up and kills Jake by shooting him in a probic vent. The 6th Doctor finds himself on the colony planet with Sarah Jane, where he must stop the Nestine consciousness from destroying the planet with plastic humans that it's grown. He's eventually able to do so by dropping a bomb that contains pure anti-plastic onto the consciousness. The 7th Doctor finds himself in 1665 with Nyssa, where he must stop the Rani from releasing a nerve gas across the planet, which will wipe out the population. The Rani is eventually defeated and the gas is stopped. However, part of the gas is released into the atmosphere, which results in the creation of the Great Plague. Finally, the 8th Doctor finds himself in Egypt in 40 BC with Ace, where he must stop a full-on Dalek invasion and save the people of Egypt. He's eventually able to do so by blowing up Dalek Command, which is located within the pyramid, using Ace's rucksack, which is filled with Nitro-9. Eventually, Bernice, Susan and Victoria are able to free the 4th Doctor, where they go to confront the Master in the control room. The Master attempts to shoot them, however Bernice knocks him out cold with a swift punch, before tying him up to his hat stand. The 4th Doctor then uses the Master's TARDIS to make contact with his other selves and unlock their TARDISes, as well as freeing his first incarnations from the temporal pocket. We then see all 8 of the Doctor's TARDISes and the Master's TARDIS landing in an Earth-like castle, where all of the Doctors, bar 1 and 2, who remain in their TARDISes, reunite with their rightful TARDISes and companions. Then suddenly the Master's TARDIS takes off, as we see that the Master has freed himself. 8 is annoyed that he got away, before 4, with a wink and a grin, says, "Oh, don't worry, he won't get too far." Then cut to the Master's TARDIS, as we see him press a switch on the console with an evil laugh. before we see his TARDIS being pulled into the temporal pocket. We then end with the Doctors saying goodbye to one another, with the Doctors saying goodbye to the companions they worked with in that story. They then enter their rightful TARDISes, with Susan and Victoria entering theirs and dematerialise. Season 30 was a big success for Doctor Who, bigger than Season 28 and 29. Rating and viewing figures continue to stay strong across the board, with many feeling that the dark times of the show are coming to an end. Audiences widely agreed that Rain and Higgs received good departures from the show, and many instantly clicked with Bernice, feeling that she offered something new to the table. And so, the production team had done it. They'd stuck the landing and proved Doctor Who's worth in the 1990s. Although the show had never gone away, in the minds of many people, Doctor Who was back.